It's a Tuesday evening in November. Millions of Americans have cast their votes. Poll workers are closing up stations across the country. Election officials are tallying results. Everything seems normal. But deep inside computer networks across dozens of states, something else is happening. Digital intruders are moving through systems that hold the most sacred foundation of democracy itself. They're accessing voter databases, election management systems, and critical infrastructure that keeps our elections running. This isn't some dystopian fantasy. This actually happened. The hackers didn't just peek through a window. They kicked down the front door, walked through the house, and made themselves at home. They accessed systems in all 50 states. They compromised the networks of companies that build voting machines. They infiltrated databases containing information on millions of registered voters. And for years, nobody knew they were there. This is the story of how foreign adversaries broke into the heart of American democracy. It's a story that involves state-sponsored hackers, election vendors with shockingly weak security, and government officials who were caught completely off guard. It's also a story that's still unfolding today, because these same vulnerabilities continue to exist in systems across the country. The scale of what happened is staggering. We're not talking about a single breach or one isolated incident. This was a systematic, coordinated campaign that targeted the electoral infrastructure of the most powerful nation on Earth, and it succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. Here's what makes this even more terrifying. The hackers didn't just break in and leave. They established persistent access. They created backdoors. They positioned themselves to potentially manipulate future elections. Think about that for a moment. Foreign adversaries gained the ability to access systems that determine who leads our country. But this story doesn't start with the hack itself. It starts years earlier, with decisions made in boardrooms and government offices that left our election systems vulnerable to attack. It starts with the digitization of voting, the rush to modernize systems, and the fatal assumption that nobody would dare target something as fundamental as elections. The first signs something was wrong came in the summer of 2016. Election officials in Illinois noticed unusual activity on their voter registration database. Someone was probing the system, testing for weaknesses. At first, they thought it might be routine scanning from security researchers or even legitimate traffic, but the activity was too focused, too deliberate. Someone was specifically targeting their election infrastructure. What happened next sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The hackers didn't just probe the Illinois system. They broke in completely. They accessed the personal information of over 90,000 registered voters. Names, addresses, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, partial social security numbers. All of it was compromised. But Illinois was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered the attack was far more widespread than anyone initially realized. The same group of hackers had targeted election systems in at least 21 states. They had successfully penetrated systems in several of them, and they had been inside these networks for months without being detected. The hackers weren't random cybercriminals looking for credit card numbers or personal data to sell on the dark web. These were sophisticated state-sponsored operatives with unlimited resources and a clear mission. Intelligence agencies would later confirm what many suspected from the beginning. The attacks came from Russia. Russian military intelligence, known as the GRU, had launched a comprehensive assault on American election infrastructure. They weren't just trying to steal information. They were mapping out systems, understanding how they worked, and positioning themselves for potential future operations. They wanted to know how American elections functioned at the most technical level. The scope of their operation was breathtaking. They targeted not just state election systems, but also the private companies that build voting machines and election management software. They went after firms like VR Systems, which provides election software to dozens of states. They compromised email systems at these companies and gained access to sensitive technical documents. Through these breaches, the Russians learned intimate details about how American voting systems operate. They discovered vulnerabilities in software. They mapped out network architectures. They identified the vendors that different states relied on. It was like getting blueprints to every major election system in the country. In one particularly brazen operation, they sent spear-phishing emails to over 100 local election officials. These weren't crude mass emails that most people would immediately recognize as suspicious. They were carefully crafted messages that appeared to come from VR Systems, the election software company. The emails contained malicious attachments designed to give the hackers access to local election networks. The level of preparation and reconnaissance that went into these attacks was extraordinary. The Russians had spent months studying American election systems, identifying key vendors, and mapping out the relationships between different organizations. They knew exactly who to target and how to approach them. What made these attacks so effective was the inherent weakness of election infrastructure itself. Many states and localities were using outdated systems with known security vulnerabilities. They had limited cybersecurity budgets and staff. Many election officials had no training in cybersecurity whatsoever. The Russians were essentially attacking soft targets that had never been designed to withstand sophisticated cyber warfare. The hackers also exploited something that most people don't realize about American elections. While we think of elections as being run by the federal government, they're actually managed by thousands of different state and local jurisdictions. Each has its own systems, procedures, and security practices. This decentralized approach creates thousands of potential entry points for attackers. The Russians understood this perfectly. Rather than trying to hack into one centralized system, they could target the weakest links in a vast network of interconnected election infrastructure. If they couldn't get into one state's systems directly, they could compromise a vendor that served multiple states. If they couldn't access voter databases through the front door, they could find side entrances through less secure networks. As investigators pieced together the full scope of the Russian operation, they realized something chilling. The hackers hadn't just broken into election systems to cause immediate damage, they had established a foothold that could be used in future elections. The most disturbing part wasn't what the hackers took. It was what they left behind: hidden back doors, persistent access mechanisms, digital keys that could unlock these same systems months or even years later. They had essentially planted sleeper cells throughout American election infrastructure. Intelligence officials discovered that the Russians had been exceptionally patient and methodical. They didn't rush in and grab everything they could find. Instead, they moved slowly and carefully, establishing multiple points of access and covering their tracks as they went. This wasn't a smash-and-grab operation. It was a long-term intelligence-gathering mission. The hackers demonstrated a deep understanding of how American elections actually work. They knew that simply accessing voter registration databases wouldn't be enough to manipulate election outcomes. But they also knew that even the perception of election interference could be incredibly damaging to American democracy. They were playing a much more sophisticated game than anyone initially realized. In Arizona, investigators found evidence that Russian hackers had accessed the state's voter registration system and downloaded information on hundreds of thousands of voters. But they had been so careful about covering their tracks that election officials didn't discover the breach until federal investigators alerted them months later. The hackers had been inside Arizona's systems for over a year. Similar patterns emerged across the country. In Wisconsin, hackers had probed systems in multiple counties. In Florida, they had targeted election supervisors in at least 2 counties and successfully compromised their email systems. In California, they had attempted to break into systems in Los Angeles County, one of the largest election jurisdictions in the nation. The private sector presented an even more attractive target. Election vendors often had weaker security than government agencies, but they had access to systems in multiple states. By compromising a single vendor, hackers could potentially access election infrastructure across dozens of jurisdictions. VR Systems became a prime example of this vulnerability. The company provided election software and services to states across the country. When Russian hackers compromised their networks, they gained insights into election systems far beyond what they could have achieved by targeting individual states. They accessed customer lists, technical specifications, and even communications between the company and election officials. The hackers were particularly interested in how different states managed voter registration databases. These systems contain the fundamental information that determines who can vote and where. By understanding how these databases operated, the Russians could potentially identify ways to manipulate voter rolls or cause confusion on election day. They also focused heavily on election management systems. These are the computer networks that election officials use to program voting machines, manage ballot layouts, and tabulate results. Access to these systems could theoretically allow hackers to alter vote counts or cause widespread technical failures during elections. What made the situation even more dangerous was that many election officials had no idea their systems had been compromised. The hackers were skilled at moving through networks without triggering security alerts. They used legitimate administrative tools and stayed within normal usage patterns. To most monitoring systems, their activity looked like routine maintenance or authorized access. Federal investigators later revealed that the Russian operation had multiple objectives. Gathering intelligence was clearly a primary goal, but they were also testing defenses, mapping out vulnerabilities, and positioning themselves for potential future operations. They wanted to understand exactly how they could disrupt American elections if they chose to do so. The psychological impact was just as important as the technical capabilities they developed. By demonstrating that they could penetrate election systems at will, the Russians were sending a clear message: American democracy was not as secure as most people believed. The very foundation of democratic governance could be undermined by skilled adversaries operating from thousands of miles away. Perhaps most troubling of all was how long the intrusions went undetected. In many cases, hackers had been inside systems for months or even years before anyone noticed. This meant they had ample time to study how elections actually functioned, identify additional vulnerabilities, and establish multiple backup methods of access. The detection that finally occurred often came not from the targeted organizations themselves, but from federal intelligence agencies who had been tracking Russian cyber operations. Many state and local election officials learned about breaches in their own systems only when FBI agents showed up at their offices with evidence of the intrusions. This revelation sparked urgent questions about the security of American elections that continue to this day. If sophisticated adversaries could penetrate election systems so easily, what did that mean for the integrity of democratic processes? How could voters trust results when the systems that produced those results had been compromised? The Russian operation had exposed fundamental weaknesses in how America conducts elections. The decentralized nature of the system, while providing some protections against large-scale manipulation, also created countless vulnerable entry points. The reliance on private vendors with varying security standards had introduced additional risks that few people had considered. But the hackers weren't finished. Even as investigators worked to understand the full scope of what had already happened, evidence emerged that the same adversaries were preparing for future operations. The 2016 intrusions had been reconnaissance. The real attack might still be coming. The story of how hackers broke into American election systems isn't just a cautionary tale from the past, it's a present and ongoing reality. Right now, as you watch this video, those same vulnerabilities still exist across thousands of election systems nationwide. The backdoors planted years ago may still be active. The intelligence gathered then continues to inform adversarial operations today. What happened in 2016 was just the beginning. It was a reconnaissance mission that mapped out American election infrastructure in unprecedented detail. Foreign adversaries now possess blueprints to our democracy that they never had before. They know exactly where the weak points are, which vendors to target, and how to move through networks undetected. The most chilling part isn't what these hackers accomplished, it's what they chose not to do. They had the access, they had the capability. They could have caused chaos on election day, deleted voter records, or manipulated results. But they didn't. They were patient, they were strategic. They were planning for something bigger. This is our democracy we're talking about. The very foundation of how we choose our leaders and decide our future. And it's more vulnerable than most people realize. The question isn't whether sophisticated adversaries can break into election systems. They already have. The question is what they plan to do with that access next time. Every election moving forward carries this shadow. Every vote cast exists in a system that has been thoroughly mapped and compromised by foreign adversaries. Until we fundamentally rethink election security, This threat will only continue to grow. Our democracy depends on getting this right.